Rogers TV. The following program was provided by a valued member of our local community. Rogers TV is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions. For more information, please visit our website. The opinions expressed in the following programs are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers Cable or Rogers TV.
Hello, NB Poli Pod World. Welcome back to another week. I am Brent Harris. I'm here with my illustrious co-host, Joanna Killen.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, hello. And we are in Mennequist, or St. John, New Brunswick, on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoq, and the Pescatomakati people. And we're heading, this is the last week of a federal election, Joe. It's a pretty big deal.
We're going to know by this time next week who our new prime minister is.
That's
or
it.
Remains. We shall see.
And there's a lot at stake. And we've got a great guest. I'm going to get you to introduce our guest in just a second, Joe. I thought just for our listeners, we talk a lot about polling. I will point everybody to the RIT. Eric Grenier is a great pollster himself, but he also does a lot of aggregate work. We've talked about Polera numbers on this. Of course, you can get, if you listen to the Curse of Politics, you get Polera's numbers every day, which is unique for them, which is cool. But there's a lot of information going around about conservatives swelling in the polls. So let's just see what the aggregate is telling us. Liberals have dropped a little bit to 42.7 in the poll tracker as their lead over the conservative slides 4 points. The conservatives are unchanged at 38%. So the story here is, yes, there was a poll that went around Main Street. Some of you may see it on your social medias. I did a little TikTok covering, the fact that there's a ton of people who I've never seen politically active who are just blitzing conservative content. And every one of them, even though 2 weeks ago they were saying, we don't believe in the polls, they're now saying, hey, look, Main Street says our guy's in first place. And it's true. Main Street is the outlier poll here. They do have Polyev at 40, essentially a tie with Mark Carney, 44 points each. But even them, they have the seat count as being heavily favored for the Liberals. So they have Mark Carney at 42 on aggregate. They have Polyev at 38, Jagmeet at 8.4, and Yves Francois Blanchette at the Bloc at 5.9. So this would cover all the polls that were updated in the last 24 hours from Main Street, Nanos, Pallas, Abacus, Leger. And the one thing that they can say, and we'll stop it here because we've got a great guest, we'll get to that interview. But the one thing everybody seems to be pointing at is, yes, it does look like the Conservatives have tightened things a little bit, but the Liberals are still set to make gains in Quebec, major wins in Ontario and Atlantic Canada. And the one thing I was listening to them talk about as far as BC, which is another battleground, is that it doesn't seem like there is a sense of why the Liberals are doing. They know that BC-wide, the Liberals are polling quite well. The Conservatives are doing good too. But when they've talked to certain folks on the ground, nobody seems to know where the Liberals are doing well. Is it mainland BC? Is it the interior? Is it the Rockies? Is it, the cities like Surrey? Or is it, this Vancouver itself? So there's those question marks to be answered, but all will be revealed, like you say, in 6 days, essentially.
Yeah, less than a week now. So, liberal, conservative, no matter what, there's always been this, talk of growth. And our guest today, I had as a professor in my years at UNBSJ, and he still remains there doing lots of great work. And we came across him more recently, about, I say 2 years ago now, on the podcast when I got into looking up things about more about sort of industrial related things to do with kind of Irving, how they've impacted our community, things like that.
As well as I think it was AIM Recycling at the time too. You were looking at some of the background about that.
Trying to unpack how did we end up here, right? Yeah. And of course, this great article comes up, and we'll post maybe on our socials about the sort of myth of growth that's been paraded around our dear Maritimes here for quite some time. So we have the author, and I'll get him to introduce himself as well, because he's done a lot more and does a lot more here in our community. So welcome, Dr. Greg Marquis.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
absolutely.
fantastic to have you. Yeah, if you could give us a little bit of your background. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've been teaching Canadian history and legal history, social history at UNB St. John for a quarter of a century, hard to believe. And I'm from St. John originally, grew up on the west side, and left to go to school and work and things like that, and came back many years later to teach at UNB St. John, where my academic career began as an undergraduate many years ago.
Nice. Of course, I've talked a little bit on the pod before. I went to Mount A, so I did not get to cross paths. But Joe has spoken quite highly of the course that she took there, and we both went through your work on growth fallacies. So I guess the starting question is, like, we got a broad conversation we could have. We could definitely take more than an hour of your time, but we won't. No, mostly because Rogers TV won't let us, and and for other reasons. But I'm sure you also have other things you've got to do. But to start, one question I had was, is there anything in this election so far, like, we'll kind of go up to the 10,000 foot level instead of looking just at the New Brunswick experience? Is there a change in how parties are talking about growth kind of writ large? What do you see as the risks to the conversation that we're having right now around an economy that needs to, like everybody agrees, needs to change, needs to mature and develop new dance partners, but has existed in this sort of holding pattern for a long time? And yeah, how would you characterize that conversation?
Well, it's sort of, I mean, there's some continuities in some of the political messaging, but there's also, because the ground seems to have shifted so dramatically, with the Trump tariffs and just Trump in general, a lot of the things that were taken for granted in the past are now sort of up in the air. So if I was a political strategist, I'm not sure what I would be doing, because it's very unpredictable. Obviously, we've seen things like premiers talking about trying to, create more internal free trade within Canada, trying to shift trade. But boy, I mean, it seems like a big stretch to, in the short and medium term, to shift trade to the extent of replacing a lot of that trade with the U.S. Right now, and I haven't followed all the economic messaging at the detailed level by the different parties, but I know that there's still a lot of emphasis on pipelines and infrastructure and things like that. And, again, maybe you've talked to them already, but economists might be able to better advise shows like this about what are some of the likelihoods here of major investments happening in this climate. Like, even if you wanted to build a pipeline or whatever, who would finance it? It seems to me that the Trump situation has created a lot of uncertainty, so you can't wish a pipeline or, a mine or, a port project into being if you don't have the customers and the investors and things like that. And of course, there's also the risk in the kind of panic mode of, forgetting or downplaying things like environmental assessments and, indigenous issues and things like that. So we see sometimes in the past that things are done in haste, that some of these more democratic guardrails are, are weakened, right? So again, that's my gut response to this, not being an economist. And,
sure.
Yeah. And a city like St. John, I mean, the St. John area, we've been told that it's the most, heavily dependent on exports and tariff, but again, an economist might be able to unpack that. I mean, I think that's a bit alarmist, but there's certainly some numbers that are out there, right? In terms of imports and exports and things like that, and in jobs. And it feeds, and again, in my work, urban studies work in St. John, I've tried to apply sort of themes from the urban studies literature as to how different growth coalitions, political parties, interest groups try to influence the narrative around growth and about economic development, and who's at the table and who is not, right? So it's kind of hard to tell right now. I think a lot of the people involved in the growth, what I would call the growth coalition, are kind of hoping for the best, because I'm not sure they know what's happening here, right? So.
So who and maybe you, I don't know if you've got anything to add in here, Joe, but one question I was going to ask you, in the past, like we can bring it to the New Brunswick experience, because I think, you're right. We don't have an economist here, but my beef with economists goes quite a long ways. And I have reached out. We have reached out to a few of them.
I feel too, like those who understand history, are the ones who are not doomed to repeat it. So you sort of have to me, a better understanding of the realities around here and, in Canada as well. Because I do think that we've acted in haste before. We've acted, not strategically, and, looking at this in a different way, I think could actually, maybe help us out and make things actually work better at this time. But that is yet to be determined. There's a lot of chaos at this point and uncertainty to what you're saying. But who are these growth people? Like who?
Well, I mean, in any city, it's the major employers. Could be industrial enterprises. It could be even like the real estate industry. Downtown property owners, major property owners, major employers. Could be the public sector as well. In terms of government, municipal. We have things like, say, Port St. John, that's kind of specific to St. John, but that model exists in other port cities as well. And that's it's not, Port St. John is not really like an accountable sort of, like, in terms of directly accountable. It's kind of an appointed thing, and I think people have to study it a bit more. I mean, it's a model that federal government has gone with, ports have gone with in other parts of Canada as well, and railway companies, depending on the local economy. Trade unions can be part of that as well, interested in maintaining jobs and things like that. Even the cultural sector, in a weird way, can be part of the Growth Coalition if you're trying to brand your city as a destination place, theater, festivals, that type of thing. So the media, so in terms of the broader analysis on these growth coalitions, it can be many people at the table. Of course, it could be municipal politics, provincial, federal. In the US, it would be state, state and federal, even county, So you can kind of take that general template of the growth coalition and apply it to your specific case study, whereas St. John, Halifax, you'll find that often there's business groups that will be promoting growth and investment. They might have different names. And again, from our point of view, in St. John, where we often struggle, we often look at other cities where they seem to be doing somewhat better. But even these other cities have these business groups, that they're working full time, to attract people and investment. We thought, and some people would say we'd love to have their problems, but even in high growth areas, you have these business groups that are engaged in lobbying and image building and things like that, right? Yeah. So again,
so I guess another follow-up question to that, and this might reveal where we go next. Who isn't at the table when we're talking about growth? And I guess to preface it, the Conservatives talk about growth, the Liberals talk about growth, the NDP talk about growth in a different way, the Green Party talk about degrowth and sustainability, and those two voices, the NDP and the Greens, are like largely unrepresented in the discourse of things. But beyond the political sort of embodiment, who isn't at the table when we're talking? Often, I guess, maybe not permanent, like holistically, but like who isn't there?
Well, in terms, just one quick response to your comment, in the academic literature, you often read about slow growth movements. They try to slow growth down, right, and maybe make it more strategic, and that kind of fits into environmental concerns and neighborhood concerns that anti-gentrification, that type of thing. Well, I think historically, I would say the neighborhoods, and working class and poorer people. So people who aren't part of the, I hate to use the 1960s term, the establishment, but so, people who are, people in groups that are on the margins. Again, you can see in different cities where a lot of the projects, that are promoted by government and business, often they don't trickle down to those neighborhoods, some of those disadvantaged people. And often these people don't get much say in these projects as well, right? So they're sort of excluded from the decision making. So it's a two-way thing, right? And again, I think it happens in every community. It's not just a St. John thing, but certainly I think there is a historic pattern of this sort of who's at the table and who's not.
Just give me 1 second, Joe. If you want to keep talking to Greg, I'm just going to.
I'll actually come get her because she's probably hungry. Just one second.
Yeah, we got a little one here in the background, and we just put her down, and we thought, oh, she'll be good for like 45 minutes to an hour. We're good. And then she's just like, no, I am gonna stay awake.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, but there's so much to this growth conversation, which is important to figure out. And for our listeners and for our part, like our pod does try to nuance the conversation. If we're going to have a conversation about growth, let's talk about who growth is for. Maybe we can veer a little bit into your work around growth fallacies, your follow-up piece, part 2 to that, which was published recently. What you identified, I think, very well who's missing from the conversation on growth. And I like to say, like, that's the question of who growth is for. Is growth for the people that already have something, or is growth, for the people who don't? But what are some of those fallacies that we have believed that parties have cashed in on, have won elections on, that corporations have benefited from? Like, I've read a little bit of George Monbiot, and one of the things he talks about is this slippage, right? This encroachment by corporations and industrial partners around the commons. There's Beatrice now. And so, without getting too philosophical, what are some of those fallacies that have really played out that are kind of that you've covered over your work?
Yeah, I think that piece was a sort of it was a blog post for Acadiensis. It was just based on some thoughts on. It wasn't intently detailed thing, but the part 1 was kind of a few years earlier was kind of a summation of an article I published at the time about growth coalitions, and then it hit me that during sort of COVID we were seeing this what I call a reindustrialization of St. John. Now I was using that in a very general sense. Building a power line isn't like a factory, but just this idea of like suddenly there are these alterations on the skyline of St. John, and most people will report either not commenting on this or portraying it as an overwhelmingly positive thing. So new cranes on the water, and again, when I saw the cranes on the waterfront, my first thought was, well, what about all the railways that are rail cars that are going to be operating on the west side? And people often, unless you live in those neighborhoods, weren't even thinking about this. And so I think, this idea of like things trickle down, that if we have growth, we need infrastructure, build things, right? And so what is that really going to help the community? And so this idea of trickle down, that the benefits will be spread out. Well, has anyone ever tested that? It just seems to be something that gets repeated and repeated with every big project. And I think the urban studies literature suggests that any of these big projects the benefits are always oversold and they always underperform, right? And then there's environmental risks. I mean, look at AIM, someone needs to do really an academic study on how that thing got put on our waterfront, and who at the time thought it was a good idea. I would bet within the Growth Coalition, there'd be crickets chirping, in terms of no one probably saw it as a bad idea at the time.
That's right, nobody. But Joe, I'll leave this to Joe, because Joe did a pretty good deep dive into the AIM story. Went through the archives, went through the library, did all the microfiche film stuff. Like it was
because it really did try to see your word oversold is exactly what it was. It was you could track all the different times they announced 100 jobs are coming, 80 jobs. It's only going to be 60. And turned out it was 5.
So St. John is hungry for jobs. I mean, it's been its nature. I mean, so I in some of my writing, I've tried to portray St. John as almost desperate for jobs and employment and tax, tax base. This idea that if we get one business, it attracts another. And we have to admit, like, we like to see some activity. Like personally, I was in Market Square a couple of weeks ago, and I was actually it kind of cheered me up to see that there's some businesses and a coffee shop now. So I mean that's human nature. And then you go to the other mall, and you're still a little bit down because there's not much happening in the other mall. We'd like to have a livelier uptown, but it's but yeah. So and the idea that we have to have almost we have to make special deals. It's like now or never, or whether it's tax deals or water deals or whatever. And the province does it as well, right? Because this idea we don't want to lose these investments or these industries, and we tend to. And again, we need. I think any economist would tell you we do need a healthy private sector. But a lot of people forget that when they talk about 100 jobs here, 200 jobs here, there's 4,000 people who work at the regional hospital. That's 4,000 jobs. So and that's putting money into the economy as well as well into the family.
Well, and the regional hospital pays more toward the city, at least in tax output, than the refinery does.
Okay.
So it's a bit staggering when you say that, to say the country's largest refinery contributes less than the local regional hospital does to the tax base, but it does. And so I we often hear as councillors, especially with this recent hearing that took place around the park that they wanted to produce a parking lot on and build an overpass for their contractors so that JDI can expand their mill, park their contractors on site, and them not be having to take a bus or whatever to their job site. But it got shot down, or it got approved in a way that they were not happy with, so they walked away from the proposal. But you look at that and you say, okay, there's $1 billion project. They call that a mega project in Canada. It's going to create a lot of construction jobs to build this stuff, but it looks like there's going to be 10 fewer jobs, full-time jobs at the mill on the west side, as an example, than there is today when it's finished, because of the level of automation that they're putting in.
Yeah.
So when we talk about this growth coalition, and we hear Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre talk about building things again and big projects to drive home powerful paychecks, as Pierre's rhyme scheme goes, or Mark Carney talking about energy corridors and one-stop shops for big project approvals and all this, like, is there what's in it for New Brunswick? And when we look at, like, from a sustainability feature for cities, I guess my question is about the other cities too. It's like, you've done a good job at describing St. John's experience here with some of this. Where does it go? But then what about the growth that Fredericton's experiencing in Moncton? Have there been sort of some substantial observations there about those outcomes?
I haven't looked at that. I mean, it's fairly recent. I'm an historian, but to me, it's what's interesting about Moncton and Fredericton. It's kind of non-industrial growth, right? We're not talking about train yards and ports and scrap metal. Well, I know there's that issue in Moncton, but yeah. So it's just it seems to be more organic and small scale and I think it's the same way Halifax grows. When people want to move there, Halifax grows by 15% a year. It doesn't matter what's going on in the economy, and of course, there's government there, there's universities, right? Sure. Yeah, but I think that every city has its power players, and I'm sure if you talk to someone in depth about Moncton politics or Greater Moncton or Fredericton, there'd be probably revelations of divisions in those communities and haves and have-nots and things like that. But I think in St. John, just because we've had this industrial city reputation, these big powerful players, and often backed up by the media that they owned, right? Yeah. Recently, it's almost like you can almost read the urban newspapers for certain years and see what is the growth coalition, because basically they're just printing the message, So and it's almost like you're reading the urban studies textbook when you're reading somebody, and different speeches by business groups and things like that. But yeah, certainly, we keep telling ourselves that younger people are really interested in climate change and the environment and all that. And there's a little bit of a danger as I go back to what I said earlier, as we're responding in a short-term crisis, that some of that stuff will be, maybe neglected or diminished, right? And because building pipelines is not really a recipe for dealing with climate change. I don't think you have to be a scientist to figure that one out. And again, the economic climate, I don't think is conducive to any of these big projects now, right? And I don't think it will be for some time. I mean, even if Trump is out of office, my understanding is that there's a protective wave that's welling up in the United States, right? And so it could be, we've been, even before the free trade deal of the late 80s, early 90s, whatever, we were in a virtual free trade arrangement with the United States. The tariffs were so low. Now they're starting to climb back up again. And even if they are being used strategically as like hammer blows by the Trump administration to try to get deals with other countries, the tariffs are still going to be higher, and also it's going to be very unpredictable. So again, we're getting this little crystal ball here, but what will a growth coalition do in the near future? I mean, that's the big question, right? So.
Yeah, they're kind of unmoored right now. You don't have that reliable old narrative that you sort of did before. Because it's true, it was regurgitated in some of my comments at this hearing with Irving. I mentioned it to them that you guys have kind of been using this story over and over that this project is going to fold. You're putting everything at risk. St. John doesn't care about growth, all that kind of stuff. We are mean to businesses. We are cruel to the private sector. Is kind of some of the latest insults that were hurled. Which I just, looking back at it, it seems like they haven't even really augmented the script very much. So I'm super curious to see how this will be sold to us as we move forward.
Yeah, and again, I didn't follow the park thing. I grew up on the West Side, and I don't get there as often as I used to. But it just I didn't know about the overpass. That's
it was a little walking path.
Okay, yeah. But I'm trying to think. At one point when I was at UNB St. John, I was taking 2 buses each way to get to work because we had one car, I think things do spin a bit differently in St. John. I'm sure of like a major company in Halifax said we want to, use a park for 5 years and cut down half the trees. Well, there would be a firestorm. Firestorm. Cutting, like, that's what no one mentioned. The cutting down trees. How would they put all those vehicles there? Cutting down a lot of those old trees.
Yep.
But it seemed to me that I haven't followed a lot of detail, but the council was offering a compromise, and when they didn't bite on the compromise, it would suspect that they had a longer term.
Right. So there's an agenda on the site that they weren't willing to reveal their hand about. And Mr. Irving said as much. It was a surprise to me to see Mr. Irving show up and actually, handle himself on his own matters. And he did. And I thought he did quite well. Very charming. He's clearly been coached. He clearly knows when he can kind of put on the sort of the power broker and then put on the charming, I'm just like you kind of guy. That's what he's groomed for. I get it. But at the same time, he said very clearly to council, and I this is a podcast about New Brunswick politics.
Yeah.
And I don't want our listeners, other parts of the province to check out here, because like it or not, the rest of this province was built through St. John by the reality of St. John as an urban center and port powerhouse for 100 years.
Yeah.
And I know people, don't look at us that way any longer, but there is something timely about this right now where you see this federal obsession about trading with Europe. That isn't going to happen through Halifax because they're maxed. They have no land. They have no space. They have a corridor problem. Yeah. And we have a 140-mile advantage on them by rail to most major trade corridors or raw materials. So we want to trade more with Europe. They are a bigger market than the United States is. They have 100 more million people in them. Yes, the economy is different. But at the same time, it's going to have to happen through the Port of St. John in many ways. And, we are this city that's been owning this type of industrialization for the province, and with the province in many ways. Like, do you see in your work, I guess that was a lot of preamble to this question, sorry. But do you see, like, historically how the game has changed in this province for how we dovetail with the US or dovetail with the country itself, with Ottawa? And where does it seem to be that we're at now?
Well, we've always, there's always been a lot of trade with the U.S. Even at the time of Confederation, and of course, a lot of the timber trade was overseas to Britain. And when that died out, things shifted. The Canadian economy did get integrated to a certain extent. I'm a little sketchy on where exports were going, like before, World War II sort of thing.
Right.
But certainly, you've seen the stats recently. We're over specialized, right? I often point out to my class, like, Canadians do this thing. Okay, the cod fishery in Newfoundland, or the energy patch in Alberta. Like, it's really good. Let's just do more of it, right? And then when things go under, whoops, so over specialization. And again, we've been integrated, not just trade, but we hear a lot about the supply chains, right? The different businesses on either side of the border are so integrated with supply chains now. And a lot will depend also on how the Canadian dollar does, I think, too, right? So there's just so much. I mean, to think about, we're doing like 90% by value of exports. Of course, a lot of that is petroleum products. It's in and out, right? And I don't think any government would want to give up maybe that revenue, but I don't think that creates a lot of jobs overall. But I mean, it does kind of look good on the books in terms of, you've got millions and millions coming in every year. A lot of what we import is by value is oil from offshore, right? Mm-hmm. But then we're refining it and sending it on to the States and a little bit to other parts of Canada. So I just don't know enough about what world trade means right now. It just seems like a long way to get stuff to Europe, whereas now you can drive it by truck and, in one day to the United States.
In New England, in that corridor.
Yeah, and I've heard that, a lot of the fuel for cars and trucks in New England is supplied. That's what I've heard. I've never fact checked that, but that a lot of the fuel that people are, getting at gas stations in New England is supplied out of New Brunswick.
Yeah.
So, but again, it just seems a long, like to change this huge pattern, and it just seems a huge challenge. Of course, the other, and the tariffs, are going to raise the cost of living for people too, right? So on both sides of the border, right? So that's that could create some pressure points and create more of a kind of a crisis atmosphere that politicians could take advantage of, or we're entering into some uncharted waters here. I think we're used to a little bit of a crisis in New Brunswick, but this is like crisis on steroids.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we're in a bit of a bubble right now with this election, because we have just all these promises and things floating around. We don't actually have that. We don't have the reality of what's really settling in here in front of us yet.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, because I don't think, whether liberals or conservatives win, I don't think there's going to be any real magic bullet for the economic side of things, because it's so unpredictable. And tariffs, I know when we used to have the national policy tariff here, John M. Macdonald and all that, like back in the late 1800s, they used to say, like the textbooks say that maybe it was good if you're in one of those towns where they had a factory, maybe you got some jobs from that protected industry, and that industry sold on the Canadian market, but that raised the cost of living by about 15% to the average Canadian. Right. And so the price of that economic nationalism.
Yeah. The Canadian made clothes that you wore were way more expensive.
Yeah. And so, and what's interesting too, I was looking back, like I'm old enough to remember the free trade debate in the 80s. And that was very emotional. 1988, I think, in that important election.
Turner versus Mulroney,
yeah, and I think New Brunswick split five Liberals, 5 PCs. I was teaching at Mount A at the time, but what's interesting then is we've heard a lot of rhetoric about Trump and different, trying to make Canada the 51st state. Well, at the time, the Liberals and NDP, and they weren't all in agreement, who opposed the free trade deal in principle, were warning that if we enter into a free trade agreement with the United States, it would make us the 51st state. Of course, we did. we did, and now the,
Now
the
it's back.
history is that people who are, when the free trade agreements are, of course, it's been renamed. It was renegotiated under Trump, right, a few years ago.
Kuzma, yeah.
But so now it's been renamed, but we still have basic free trade. These tariffs are looming now. There's a threat of us being the 51st state, according to advocates of the free trade. Yeah, so it's interesting to see the ironies of history here. And of course, St. John, New Brunswick's part of a region. And it's part of the nation too, but it's not it's not a part of the nation that maybe gets a lot of attention, and certainly in the cross-border stuff, unless you're in Maine, most Americans probably don't know about New Brunswick. They don't follow the tariffs really in any real detail, I don't think, unless they're hearing Trump go on about them. Yeah, it's certainly, I think you're right about the bubble, and getting back to at least what I've been hearing from economic pundits and business pundits, it's the uncertainty, I think, would be a chill on any major private sector investment. So then it gets us back to, well, then if there's infrastructure, government would be expected to help, right? And which means taxes, public debt, that type of thing, right? So.
Yeah, and I guess like, to kind of follow that trail, that's it's pretty much undeniable that if we're going to build a pipeline, it's going to be built by public dollars. I mean, even TMX had to be built by public dollars, and this is an argument that played out for me recently on Facebook, as I had a lot of New Brunswickers chiming in and saying, on a poll showing that Polyev was going to win. Which is a major outlier, but regardless, like they made the point, like, finally we'll get somebody that deserves to run this country. And they made this point that, New Brunswickers just don't know where their bread's buttered. And I said, but listen, like, Alberta was built with Atlantic, Canadian, and Montreal and Toronto money. You didn't get a railroad built there. You didn't get people planted there through immigration. You didn't get machinery built, original investment. You didn't even get the civil engineer who pioneered the method of tar sand extraction from Alberta. They're from Ontario. And so all these pieces from I like this trend of staying on the ironies of history, as you say.
Yeah.
Like, what's the irony of history here, where you have this Western separation sentiment that's there? We have all this oil and you guys want our money, and now whatever. But now, in order to get that oil to market, they need to come back east. And there's nobody waiting in the ranks financially with a proposal for Canada East. Just like TMX couldn't be built by the private sector, it needed our public dollars.
Yeah.
What are some of those ironies that you've?
Well, again, it's hard to get into the interprovincial stuff, of Alberta, and it seems to like everything comes down to that one big sector for them, and I guess I can see that, but build a pipeline to do what? I mean, so to build what, to replace oil from Saudi Arabia, but what would the customer be? Like I think right now, I'm not sure. I think crude oil is exempt from the tariffs. I'm not sure. I don't think there's
lesser. I think it's a lesser tariff.
Okay. So in terms of, it seems like a huge risk, even if you're in favor of a pipeline, for, say, the government of Canada to build this huge pipeline. And would it get through? Would Quebec give social license, a political license? Indigenous interest, right? So you bring the oil from Alberta. What do you do with it, right? I mean, is there a 10-year plan for oil, for energy? And energy demand, and again, there's so many unknowns. So when I hear someone like Frank McKenna or whatever go on and say we need to build a pipeline, what does he know more about it than I do? Which is almost nothing.
Yeah.
So, I think these are talking points, and politicians or different public figures will repeat them because it kind of feeds into the common sense narrative, right? But again, it's not the first or last time that politicians and people in the public eye will use that type of thing, right? Or maybe for political purposes or whatever. But we've seen, again, just about little examples of St. John. We've seen so many little projects over the years that are sold as it's going to totally change everything. right? And then it's built and it doesn't change. Remember the Irving headquarters, uptown St. John, right?
Oh yeah,
Beautiful
And then-
building, but you know, the market is a ghost town, right? So the city market, right? So
yeah.
so again, it's so again at the time these things are really sold. We really need to have them, right? And then it seems when they're built, the impact is much less than promised, right? So
Yeah, and we saw
Yeah.
that from not just the Irving Oil headquarters, but from the Cook Aquaculture headquarters, and
Okay.
from the expansion of other ones. And JDI's got their headquarters. And I make the joke, it's like, how can St. John have 3 headquarters to massive billion-dollar corporations? Moncton and Fredericton don't have one, but Moncton and Fredericton have better wages overall, have less inner city poverty than we do, have better schools, infrastructure built, younger infrastructure for sure. Like, go down the list of like, what is the outcome of hosting these? And it's just like, what is that disconnect? Why we had a gentleman at, and I'd be interested to know your take on this. We had a gentleman who was presenting at city council about the park. And he made the case that was almost like a self-fulfilling argument against himself. He said, there used to be 89 wood mills in this province. Now there's only 6. And, this is one of the major ones right here, and it needs to be competitive. And as a business person, if you turn down this parking lot, you're crazy and you're anti-growth, was basically his finger-wagging statement to us councillors. But I thought to myself, but wait a minute, when there was 89 mills in this province, when my old man was alive in the 80s as a young man, he could buy a car with 1 year's wage. He could buy a house with 3 years' wage. He had more purchasing power than I do right now. He made more money than I do right now in some ways, adjusted for inflation for sure. He had a pension, he had security, and he didn't even have a university education, and I do. So it's like, why is it that when this was happening in the 80s and the 70s, where there was all this decentralization, why were we better? Like, is there something that history can show us here to answer that?
Yeah, it was certainly part of that post-war growth era, and where, you could have a fairly blue-collar, prosperous job in a place like New Brunswick. You're right, maybe without the formal training and things like that. I think those times have largely passed, all over North America. In the 60s, I just taught this. I just finished teaching a course on 1960s Canada, and the students come into it thinking that everyone was a university student. They were all hippies. They went to Woodstock. They were all feminists burning their bras. They go to Black Power. And most young Canadians left high school and went right to work.
Yeah.
Well, it's true that the universities did expand in the 60s, but we have this kind of distorted view in many ways, through pop culture and movies, stuff like that. But certainly the pro-anti-business thing is back and forth, but often the people making these arguments are not people living in the neighborhood, or whatever, right? And so they're willing to sacrifice someone else's neighborhood or quality of life for some broader principle. But yeah, no, I think, and I wasn't meaning to pick on the Irving headquarters. It was just an example, because I think I even wrote about it in one of my blog posts that, the former city planner was even getting death threats for daring to mention that, that this thing didn't go through the proper authorizations, how dare you? Like, things that wouldn't happen. Well, maybe they would happen, unfortunately, now, because politics are overheated. But typically, I lived in other cities. I lived in Halifax. I lived in Kingston, Ontario. I lived in Ottawa. I lived in Toronto. I lived in Vancouver. You wouldn't get this type of rhetoric, this overheated rhetoric, spilling out over these issues. Things seem to be a bit different in St. John because of its often struggling economy, or the perception of struggling economy. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to jump in here, Joe? Want me to come get you?
Yeah, so she's very talkative up here. It seems like they've created that narrative, though, for their own, sort of use. Because I don't think that they necessarily go around acting like this in the other jurisdictions that they do business in. That's not the sense that I would get. Like you just, mentioned Toronto, Ottawa, other places like that. I feel like they almost have a sense of entitlement to this place. That I've noticed just in the way that they've acted very, the family, if we want to call it that, has acted over. Doesn't matter if it's oil and gas or JDI or whichever, but and I don't think that they would conduct themselves in this way in U.S. markets, etc. There's an example
they don't seem to. They don't seem to do this in Maine. They don't seem to do this in Halifax. Like, you don't have this sense of Irving's, preeminence and disdain for their municipality, as you describe it, in Halifax, where Irving Shipbuilding is and where other major activity is. They have behaved quite differently in Bangor and these other places. It's a good point.
Yeah, well, Halifax much bigger, and of course, I'm sure the business and political leaders in Halifax would not like to lose the shipyard, but it's
neither did we.
Yeah, it's a major employer, but still, Halifax would survive somehow, right? And but yeah, it's a bigger player. You have 1/3 people in that area, right? So, yeah.
Here, 1 second. I'm just gonna click pause real quick. I'm gonna come trade with you, Joe. Okay, we're back. So yeah, I think, Joe, just as we were trying to bring this together here, we've got these disconnects between what's promised, what's delivered, and what the outcome is long term. And what would be a path forward, Greg, that we can talk about? Is there somewhere we can look to in Canada's past where New Brunswick went through a similar sort of upheaval and became unmoored, and then we figured out a way to remoor ourselves and maintain? Because it does seem like for the last 50 years, New Brunswick has really lagged every other province, and wherever we were supposed to be or could have been to be in a better position isn't where we're at. And if I could try to sum that question up, what can we look to for examples here?
Well, it's a tough one, because if I knew the answer, I could probably quit my job and become the market consultant in Atlantic Canada. But so many things are out of New Brunswick's control. So in the past, New Brunswick has tried to adapt and try to react to different challenges, whether it's joining Confederation, or we had a free trade deal with the States back in the 1850s, and that ended, and it looked like it was going to be pretty bad for a while, but we somehow adapted, and then joining the Canadian Confederation, and of course, so much of our larger economic issues, like the value of the dollar and things like that, are way beyond what the province of New Brunswick could ever do, right? Yeah. And so in many ways, it might be mitigating threats in the short run, as opposed to changing the ship, turning the ship around, right? So I am worried about, I know everyone's concerned about the cost of things and housing and food and, shrinkflation and things like that. I'm not, as a middle-class professional, I probably have a little easier than other people who are on fixed incomes, but I'm a little worried about discourses about, say we're heading into a turbulent time, discourses about lowering taxes. We're going to need a lot of supports for vulnerable people, even vulnerable businesses, right? And basic services. So I'm a little worried, again, we're not sure what we're heading into, but I'm a little worried that if we're heading into more unemployment, more homelessness, more drug issues, more addictions issues, all those social problems that tend to ripple out when you get an economic crisis, I'm a little worried that political leaders might not be willing and able to support those more vulnerable community members like they had in the past. And we're all, and nonprofits and volunteers are already doing so much. But getting back to the bigger picture, again, New Brunswick is a small province, in a larger federation, and it's the ability of any municipal, provincial politician to really make any major impact, I think, on economic outcomes is fairly limited. Now, getting back to process, part of my concern about community is in terms of local community-based issues, getting more citizens and neighborhood groups and social groups at the table to impact and influence decisions that are being made, right? So that's more of a local thing. It might maybe not connect to tariffs and things like that, but I guess more democracy. One of the promises of the late '60s was participatory democracy and community involvement, right? And I think St. John needs a lot more of that, right? And of course, because it's getting back to that growth coalition thing, who's at the table and who's not, whose messages and ideas are promoted and whose are not, right? Who's, and so that, to me, that's whether we're looking at tariffs or not. I think that's the long-term thing we need to work on, and maybe for all New Brunswick as well. But I'm just more, studying the St. John area.
I think that's a good point. And we've kind of seen different eras of coalitions that would maybe be on the other side. Like the Growth Coalition has remained strong and illustrious in forms of union clubs and Fusion, St. John, all that stuff. But it seems to be harder for the other to sort of stay together and actually be able to make a coalition of sorts work. I think there's a more recent one that they've started a People City blog or something around some of these growth issues, but it never seems to like sustain itself. So it's kind of the reason we both got involved in politics, is because there wasn't really anything out there that was equivalent to trying
Citizen focus. If there was, it was like the Citizens Coalition for St. John, and it was, wacko bunch of crazies that were just mad at Don Darling, right? Like that's sort of the upper limit that we see for mobilization, and there is that vacuum, and it's so the participatory democracy thing. It catches me because it's like we've talked, even around our council table about participatory budgeting. We've talked about some of the examples in Brazil of citizens literally, protesting for higher taxes because they realized that their politicians needed to be corrupt in order to get anything delivered for services, because there was so little being generated in their taxes. And it's like, where do we get that? Like, is it true? Like, can we say that New Brunswick has had that in the past?
Yeah, there have been some examples. I know, like in the 70s, there was like the South End Tenants Association. There are a number of really interesting neighborhood groups, I think. And, I think the South End Tenants Association, someone should really be studying this stuff as history.
Yeah.
They brought in like one of the first daycares in New Brunswick. They did some interesting things, right? And that's a time when the city was being hit with a lot of urban renewal.
Right, in the 80s?
Well, right. So, it's the 70s, and again, there was a lot of people in the past that did, I think, a lot of good work, and a lot of them have retired or passed away now, but I think, that kind of recent history of activism. And it's just, and I think the other thing I found about St. John, having lived in other places, it's harder to be the squeaky wheel sometimes, because you have to, you often have to deal with people in different, so if you're on a certain board or whatever, or organization, then it's hard for you to take off your hat from that board and be the guy who's complaining about the other thing, right? And so you sometimes have to play nice. Of course, play nice means a consensus thing where maybe you don't want to get into conflict with people, but that means important issues are never brought to the table, or it's only in a very circumspect way, right? And I've, I have become involved with a few organizations, and again, I've realized as I'm in these organizations, okay, I can't always speak out now because I can't jeopardize these other relationships. So again, in Halifax or Toronto, you wouldn't have to worry about these things because the community is big enough, right? They're going to expect that there's going to be an environmental group or an anti-poverty group, and that's just a lay of the land, right? I think in St. John's a bit more challenging. I mean, that's just based on my experience of living in other places,
it's funny you say that. You talk about anti-poverty groups, climate groups. St. John's probably the only place I've ever heard of that has what's called the Business Community Anti-Poverty Initiative. BCAPI, and it, to me, it is just a serious indictment against that group that the needle hasn't moved on one element of poverty alleviation and reduction for our city. We still have some of the highest rates of child poverty. We still have some of the lowest wages in the province. We still have all these features that existed for 20 years. And meanwhile, you look into what drives that initiative, because it's a nonprofit, but the business community groups, give a lot of money to it. It's all, it's directors and board members that are from Rossay and Quispam, and you don't have one person who's facing poverty at the table to drive the poverty strategy, right? It's crazy, but I mean, it's encouraging to hear about some of these groups you described from the past.
Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, I was aware of BCAP. Yeah, I hadn't really followed it lately, and I don't know that model. Again, I'm not sure the model does exist in other cities. I could be wrong, but yeah, no, it's. I think and then it's a matter, as like, to be a volunteer, you need time, you need some resources.
Yeah.
If you need family time, personal time, maybe you need a car, you need to pay for parking if you're going to go someplace, and of course that cuts down and on your potential volunteers, right? So, but I think St. John in the past has had these groups, and hopefully the cycles will come back in the future. The population is going up a little bit, which is I know that puts some pressure on housing, but maybe with more young people staying and some newcomers coming in, we'll see some more activism or community involvement, right?
Yeah, sorry, my mic was on there.
That's the hope, I think. And, we have some great history here of, union activity too, a lot around workers' rights and getting, Saturdays and weekly pay and stuff like that. So there is if there's any place that it might occur, it could be here. So it will be interesting to see. We should come back in like 6 to 8 months and see where we're at on that.
Are we any closer?
Yeah, honestly. But I appreciate having you on here. That's great for sure.
It's been an honor to come on to the show, and I wish you the best of luck.
Well, we'll be posting this, and we'll be talking anytime soon. But if our listeners do have questions for Greg, please do put them in, and if we can put something together for something down the road, maybe we can bring those back then and pull them out of the mailbag then, because I'm sure the folks on Rogers TV or on our podcast for audio, Beatrix got an opinion in the back here, will have questions, right? There's been a lot of folks that have chimed in the past, I want to say 8 months, that you can tell there's in our audience, Joe, I think that there's a wrestling with some of the perspectives. So who knows? But for our audience, our listeners, send us your questions. You can do that through our links right here. We got mbpolypod@gmail.com. You can find us on Patreon. And Greg, how's the best way? Are you on Substack? Are you putting anything out for socials?
No, not well. I mean, I have a personal Facebook, but I try not to get too public stuff on it. But I think my email at UNB is just gmarquis.
Okay.
Marquis at umb.ca. If you just Google my name, you'll get that email. For sure. Yeah.
Awesome. And we'll try to post some links to some of your past articles.
Thanks. Yeah.
Awesome. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Hey, guys.
And we'll talk to you guys later.
Here's to another week, guys.
Connect with us by visiting our website or email us at comments@rogerstv.com.
My Uncle Cheney was one of over 150,000 Indigenous children that were taken to residential schools between the 1800s and 1996. My uncle ran away from school, wanting to get home to his mom and dad, and sadly he didn't make it and died of exposure. When Gord Downey found out about my late Uncle Cheney's story, he wrote Secret Path, a series of poems that became an album, then a graphic novel, a documentary, and a concert. Gord met my family, and together we formed the Gord Downey and Cheney Winjack Fund. Together we are sharing Secret Path and other reconciliation resources with legacy schools, setting up legacy spaces across Canada, and hosting events like Secret Path Week to inspire all Canadians to engage in reconciliation. Before he left us, Gord asked us all to do something.
You're going to figure it out.
Will you join us? Together we can make Canada a better place.
Hi, I'm Bob Lennon, host of the Northern Heat Report. Join me for these inspiring stories of people who have helped make New Brunswick such an amazing place to live, visit, and experience. Don't miss our next episode of the Northern Heat Report right here on Rogers TV.
This is Rogers TV.
This is a brain in urgent need of mental health care. But because 3 out of every 4 Indigenous people experience racism in healthcare, she may not get the help